He was the longest-serving black political prisoner of the 20th century, yet even today few people know his name. Released exactly 28 years after turning on the political revolution he had initially been a part of, he was able to flee to exile and recount his ordeal. His story is difficult to stomach, of windowless cells, various torture and much, much more, but it's a story that should be heard in honor of him and his fellow Plantados and what they fought for. Eusebio Peñalver Mozara suffered for almost 3 decades in the prisons of the Isla de Pinos, La Cabaña and Boniato, around the same time as Mandela, Sisulu and their comrades on Robben Island, but on a different continent and for 1 year longer. In 1960, at the age of 24, Peñalver was one of hundreds of political prisoners who were sentenced to decades in prison in the early years of the Castro government. But Peñalver, among many others, stood out. As Castro took over Cuba, one of the changes was that imprisonment, especially of political prisoners, was not just penal punishment but also a form of re-education. Generally, those who complied saw reduced sentences and fewer punishments, but those who resisted were given special treatment. Some, with incredible bravery, continued to resist and avow their contempt for the regime and communism generally, despite inhumane conditions and punishments, earning them the moniker Plantados. Peñalver was one of these men. All the decades later, he wrote, "Many years passed and many names fade from my memory, though not the events themselves." This may become difficult listening over the upcoming minutes, but it has an ending of rebirth and hope. Peñalver saw the brutality as soon as he entered his incarceration. From his own account, "The first man I saw left to die in prison was Batista's former police captain known as the Galatian, Mantiera. I didn't know what his illness was, but I did see his suffering, and the authorities offered him no medical assistance whatsoever." Just a few years earlier, Peñalver had been a guerrilla with Che Guevara in the final days of the Batista government. But within a year after Castro took power in Cuba, Peñalver saw Castro in action, not on a platform, and was appalled. "I was sentenced to 30 years in political prison in Cuba after being captured in the Escambray Mountains, fighting against the communist tyranny imposed on my homeland. History has proven me right. The proof is that the very ills they claim to eradicate are worse than before." Within weeks after being captured, he was given an immediate trial at the Leoncio Vidal barracks in Santa Clara and was sentenced to 3 decades of forced labor in the prison of Isla de Pinos. Angel de Fana, another Plantado, said that Peñalver was often singled out by their jailers for additional punishments just for being black. Peñalver and other prisoners would later claim that on July 25, 1961, a number of prisoners formed a large protest to try to stop 4 of their fellow prisoners being taken to the punishment cell, and in frustration, possibly because their protest was succeeding, guards opened fire, leaving more than 100 injured and scores dead. This was one of many incidents. In Peñalver's words, "The soldiers on the Isla de Pinos in those early years believed they could solve all problems with gunfire." In 1964, in response to continued resistance to the revolution among various areas of the population and among political prisoners who would not show any political redemption, the forced labor program was stepped up under the Camilo Cienfuegos Special Plan from June 64 to March 67. This was so harsh, along with additional unofficial beatings and punishments, that many died from the conditions. As Peñalver put it, "They made us eat grass, they immersed us in sewage, the bayonets wounded us and hit us with enormous wood until the bones creaked for the joy of the alienated soldiers. Out of every 10 prisoners, at least 8 suffered beatings. It seems that even memory itself rejects so much brutality." In total, over his 28 years of imprisonment, he was incarcerated at the prisons of El Nicho, Bate de la Guardia, and Topes de Calantes before 2 days of waiting for his trial in the theatre room of the Leoncio Vidal Regiment in Santa Clara. Then the Castillo de Principe before finally reaching the jail in which he had been sentenced to serve out his forced labor, the Isla de Pinos. Later on, he was transferred to Cinco y Medio, the Camagüey jail, Boniato, and then Guanajay. At Guanajay, many plantados, along with Peñalver, refused to undress completely for cell searches. Eventually, in what the prisoners would come to call Black September, prisoners were taken out in small groups of just less than a dozen at a time. The hours of beatings resulted in broken bones, fractured skulls, and lacerations all over bodies. Peñalver was sent to La Cabaña, and then in 1975, he was sent to the state security headquarters for 105 days, then sent back to La Cabaña before later going to Combiano del Este. At the end of the 70s, most of the political prisoners from the early years of the revolution had now been released due to political pressure from Cuban exiles abroad, resulting in the 1979 pardons. But there were still many who, after all these years, were still refusing to say they'd changed their beliefs about the regime and were forced to carry out the rest of their sentences. For 204 of these men, a prison inside a prison, the Boniatizo inside Boniato, was established in a final effort to break them. As Peñalver said, everything was pale in the face of this cruel reality that came upon us. In the Boniatizo, these remaining plantados were held in solitary confinement with no sunlight, naked, with no prison visits and no medical assistance. But the increased suffering brought an increased bond between these plantados. Peñalver continues, "Never before have we prisoners had to be more united and understanding with each other." But the prisoners formed one more protest. When inmate count time arrived, the prisoners were supposed to stand up, but most were being held in cells not high enough for them to stand fully. The refusal of such a measure was immediate, but neither was the countermeasure. Antonio Rodriguez Hurtado, better known as Melpico, looked like a mummy because of the amount of tape they put on him from the many bayonet cuts. When they took us out of Boniatizo, there were 36 of us left. Finally, he was taken back to the Combinado del Este in Havana as his final destination before his release in October 1988. Upon his release, with assistance from the Cuban community overseas, he went to the United States, where he lived for the rest of his life. He joined Libertad para los Presos Políticos Cubanos, and in 1992, Peña, as he was known to his friends, was elected as the organization's president. Castro accused the organization in 1999 of planning to assassinate Hugo Chavez, with Peñalver saying the accusations were a smear. He was born on July 1, 1936, to Eusebio and Valeriana in Ciego de Avila in the province of Camagüey, the eldest of 6 siblings, and died in Miami on the 12th of May 2006 from cancer, leaving his widow Frances Martinez. In 2010, Eusebio Peñalver Boulevard was named in his honor in Miami-Dade County.